Before we start this video, a large thank you to Akumori, Stefan, Carter, Rob, Eric, Carlos, Jason, and Young. I hope you guys enjoy the video. Hello everybody. Okay, let's start by opening up our player UI game object. I'm just going to open this up here. Now, this is going to act as our canvas, but we didn't actually make a canvas object. So there's two things you can do here. You can right click on this and create a canvas, and you'll get the canvas pop up and it will autofill all the components you need, but I'm going to add them all manually. So I'm going to add the canvas object first, going to make sure it is set to screen space overlay. And then right below that here, I'm going to add another component to this, and it's going to be the canvas scaler. And I'm going to set the base resolution first to scale with screen size and set the reference resolution to 1920 by 1080. So that when the canvas scales, it scales according to that resolution. Now, right below that, I'm going to add the final component that would get auto-filled when you create a canvas. That's the graphic array caster, and now we're good to go. So again, you could just right-click if you wanted to and click Create Canvas, and you'll get all these little components auto-filled on a game object. You have to change it to scale with screen size manually, but other than that, you're fine. You can also add them manually, just as I did. So I'm going to create a new empty game object here now under the Player UI Manager game object, and I'm going to call it HUD Manager, because just like our player UI, I'm also going to scale that to the screen size by holding Alt and clicking it. It's going to have multiple components, so like the HUD, the equipment screen, all that good stuff. So each are going to have their own script to manage it. I'll make a new game object and call it status bars. I'm going to scale that with the screen size, but I'm actually going to adjust it so it's just up here in the top left. And as the game object name suggests, this is going to house my stat bars, my health, my stamina, and my focus points. So I'm going to anchor that to the top left, and then I'm going to create a new UI slider. Now, I'm going to rename this to Stamina Bar, and we have to change a few settings on it. So I'm going to go to the status bars first and make a vertical layout group. I'm going to set it to maybe the upper, no, we'll try, well, whatever you like really. I'll keep it to upper left and change the padding from the left and the top so it's not touching the corner of the screen. But basically when we add new bars in the future, they'll stay all in vertical alignment with one another. So on the stamina bar, I'm going to switch this to none, the transition. We don't want a transition. We don't want it to be interactable because it updates on its own. So uncheck interactable. The value, we're going to set that with a script, so that's fine right now. The whole numbers thing, again, that's just really preference. If you want to use a float or always whole numbers for your stamina bar. Now, I'm going to go to the background, and I'm going to change this to, this is just, again, stylistic preference. No image. I just want a flat color, and I'm going to change it to black. So this is just that nice programmer UI. Very simple. Nothing's really happening here. I'm going to go to the fill, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to make it so it has no image, and I'm just going to make a flat color, and I'm going to pick my stamina color, which is typically a darker or more faded out green. So that looks fine. I'm going to go to the handle next. I'm going to untick the image. I don't want a handle image, at least not right now. Maybe when we polish it, we can make it look nicer. And if you put this to the full fill here, you can see it doesn't fill up. So what we have to do is not just expand it, but rather go to the actual background area here, or rather, sorry, the fill area, and just take this and adjust it so when it's full, it covers the entire bar. And now if I empty it here and I go and put the value back up from 0 to 1, you can see it's all the way empty and then it's all the way full, and there's no black space when it's filled. Again, this is just a stylistic preference, but when it's full, I want it to just be green. When it's empty, I want it to just be black. So let's make a script here under UI underscore stat bar, and this is going to act as the base class for all of our stat bar scripts. Some might have their own class that uses the base logic but does its own thing also. But for now, we're going to keep it simple, and we're just going to use the UI stat bar. So let's first make a variable that we're going to not hide in the inspector. We're going to keep it private, slider. And in order to use the slider variable, we need to say using unityengine.ui up here, or else you're going to get an error and it won't be able to use it. So private slider, I'm going to call it slider, and this is again a reference to the slider itself, and the slider is going to reflect how much stamina we have. So I'm just going to put a comment here. In the future, we're going to make a variable to scale the size of the bar depending on your endurance stat. So basically, the more endurance you have, the higher the stat, the longer the bar is going to reach across the screen, which is a popular design in things like Dark Souls 3 and Elden Ring. And it gives a sense of progression because when you level up a stat, the bar that houses that stat increases in size, so you can see visually that you've progressed. Also in the future, we're going to make a secondary bar behind the first. It'll act as a polish, and it will show how much stamina you've consumed when you use an action. This is that little yellow flash that appears in Elden Ring and Dark Souls when you get damaged or when you swing your weapon. It just indicates how much health you've lost in this action or how much stamina you've used in this action. So that is also going to be a polished thing we're going to do. Not in this episode, though. First, we'll get all the basic functionality down first. I'm just going to make a comment here, though, because it's always nice to have laid out right in front of you what you want to do and give you something to look forward to when you come back around to this. So I'm going to make a protected virtual void awake. And I'm going to say if the slider is equal to null, then I'm going to say, actually, we're not going to say that. We're just going to say slider equals get component slider, because we're not going to be dragging that in the inspector. It's not a serializable field. If you want to serialize it, you can, and if you can say if it's null, you can grab it from get component, but I'm just going to say get component. I'm going to grab it from the script every time. So I'm going to make a public virtual void for set stat and a public virtual void for set max stat. Okay, so one here sets the max value of the slider, so the highest number it can go up to, and then one sets the current value when it updates. So let's say you use a stamina action that costs 25 stamina. Well, then you need to subtract 25 stamina from that bar, and then update the bar's new total. That's how we're going to do it. So let's make a new script called character stats manager, because now that we have stamina, we also need to create a place to house our character stats. So I'm going to create a new script too for the player stats manager, because as you know, everything that we create for the character needs to have a player variant in case the player does some logic that is different from everything else, and it will, because our player has UI and our AI, they don't have their own UI, they don't have their own stamina bar that they have to look at. We do. So the player stats manager will behave a little bit differently. So I'm going to put the player stats manager on my player prefab. And I know we're jumping around a lot, guys, so if you want to, just slow down and watch a few parts over. But let's go to the player stats manager and drop in our namespace, delete the update, and start functionality as is per tradition. And let's make it derived from the character stats manager. So again, we can take all of the logic from that script and we can adjust it with our own if we see fit. Now back on the character stats manager, I'm going to, again, drop in my namespace, delete the start and update functionality, and now we can actually start writing some logic. So what do we need first? Well, first, I'm going to make a public void for calculate my total stamina based on level. And this will be like your stamina based on your endurance level, because the stamina is how many stamina points you have, and then you have the endurance being the actual stat. I believe that's what it's called in Elden Ring anyway. So yeah, just to keep the naming conventions super Elden Ringy, we're going to say calculate stamina based on endurance level. And we pass our endurance level. So stamina is how many stamina points you have, and endurance is the stat endurance itself. It's like HP, for example. Vigor gives you your total health, so 40 vigor is something like 1200 health. I'm not sure what the calculation for stamina would be, but yeah. So let's just say float stamina is equal to 0, and then right here you can create any equation for how you want your stamina to be calculated. I'm going to keep it really simple, because this is just totally preference and depends on the balance of your game entirely. So for now, I'm just going to say stamina equals endurance times 10. Keep it very simple. Basically, for every 1 stat you have in endurance, you get 10 points of stamina. So let's go to the character network manager, and now we need to make a stat for our endurance stat, or a variable for our endurance stat, rather. So I'm going to make a header. I'm going to call it stats. I'm just going to copy and paste anything here, but I'm going to change it from float to integer, because stats are always whole numbers, things like vigor, strength, dexterity, etc. So I'm going to change this to an int, and then I'm going to change the move amount name to endurance, and I'm going to initialize it at 1, but that doesn't really matter all that much, because when we get around to making our character class selection and whatnot, we're going to change these numbers depending on which class you pick. But it's always good to have a start-off number of like 1 or 10 or something, so it's just not 0. All right, so now I'm going to go to the player UI manager and then go down to the HUD manager here. I'm going to add a new component, player UI HUD manager. And again, think of this like you think of the player. The player is the player manager, and then it has all the other extensions for all its other actions. The player UI manager has the player UI manager and all of its other extensions for its other stuff. So for the HUD, for the equipment screen, for the level up screen, for the site of grace, it's going to require different little branches of functionality. So we're going to start by making a serializable field for the UI stat bar. And we're going to call it stamina bar, obviously, because we've only made the stamina bar so far. Then we're going to make a public void. We're going to say set new stamina value. Okay. And this is just, as it suggests, we're going to basically set up the stamina bar. So now if we go back to our player manager, we're going to use this if is owner thing again, because if you are the owner, then you are the local player. And then if you are the local player, we know we have to set up your UI. So we're going to say player UI manager.instance, and then we're going to reference our HUD manager from there. And we don't have that set up yet, so let's actually go call that variable over there now before we move on. So player UI manager, let's minimize all this. And again, this acts just like our player manager. It's going to house all the logic. Just say player UI HUD manager, And then on awake, we're going to say player UI HUD manager equals get component in children. And there we go. Make it public and hide it in the inspector. We don't need to see it, but we need to reference it. So now back over here, we can say player UI HUD manager dot, and then we can fill in our function. But first, we need a couple more things before we do this. We got to think about this. We have our endurance. What else do we need as a network variable? Well, we need our current stamina and our maximum stamina. So back over here on stats, let's just copy this entire line here for the variable of endurance, and let's paste it below again. But we're going to rename it from endurance to current stamina. Now, we need to know how much stamina we have, and we also need to know our total stamina. I'm just going to initialize that at 0 because that's going to fill based on a function we use. So I'm going to say player network manager dot current stamina dot on value changed, and then we're going to say right after that plus equals player UI manager dot instance dot player UI HUD manager dot, and then we need the name of our function. And we have it called set new stamina value. And this is going to give us an error. This is because we need two things here. We need an integer for the old stat and the new stat. So in order to use on value change, we have to set it up so we must require this function to use the old value and then the new value. And now this is cool because every single time our network variable for our stamina changes, this function will get called. So when current stamina changes, let's say you do an action that consumes stamina and it makes it go down, this function gets called. Now, what are we going to do with this function? We're going to update our stamina bar. So every time you use stamina because of this event, it will automatically update the bar for you. So we're going to say stamina bar dot set stat, and we're going to pass the new value. Now let's go to the definition and make it require a new value, just like that, because it's still blank right now. And then it's very simple. We would just say, we'd reference the slider, and then we would say dot value is equal to new value. And that's really it. But we haven't set up the max stat yet, and that's very important because the max stat right now is 1, and we don't want that. So we're going to say slider.max value is equal to, we're going to make this require an int for max value. And then we're going to say slider.max value is equal to max value, and then we'll say slider.value is equal to max value. Just so whenever we increase the max value, we're also setting it back to 100%. You might not want that in certain situations, but right now it's all we need. So now, right below this, we're also going to basically set up our stamina. So I'm going to make a line of code or a comment here to saying this will be moved when saving and loading is added, because this is going to handle, or be handled rather, when you load your character into the game. But for now, we don't have that. We're just going to put it right here. So I'm going to probably get around to doing saving and loading a lot sooner than later, so we can keep adding on to it as we add new things to the game. So let's copy current stamina and paste it, and let's change this to max stamina. And again, it's the same thing. It's a network variable. But this max stamina is going to be calculated. So we're going to say player network manager dot max stamina dot value is equal to player stats manager. And we need to call that up here. We haven't yet. So let's make a variable for it. Hide an inspector, public player stats manager. And then on awake, we're going to say player stats manager equals get component player stats manager. And remember that calculation we made earlier where it basically spit out a number for us for our max stamina? That's what we're going to use. Player stats manager dot, and I think we called it calculate stamina based on endurance level. Yes, we did. Okay, so yeah, we're going to take this right here. So all we're going to do is copy this function. I'm actually going to change this to public int instead of a void, and then I'm going to say return stamina. So what that does is it's going to give us, and we're going to say mathf round to int first, so it's a whole number. It's just going to give us our stamina back as a number. So then we can say player network manager dot max stamina dot value is equal to player stats manager dot calculate stamina based on endurance level, and we pass our endurance level by saying player network manager dot endurance dot value. And that's it. There we go. And now it spits us back a max stamina value. And then we can say right below that, player UI manager dot instance dot player UI HUD manager dot, and what we want to do is set our stamina bar. So we can say set new stamina value. Oh, there's an error here. Forgot to put the closing at the end of this. I'm going to make another function here for set max stamina value. And this is just going to reference the set max stat on our slider. So we'll say max stamina. And then we pass the stamina bar. And instead of saying set stat, we say set max stat, because that's a function we've already have made there. And we pass the max stamina. And now we just call that right below the calculation. So now that we have our max stamina, we set the bar to reflect that. And that's it. That's pretty straightforward and pretty simple. Let's pass in player network manager.maxstamina.value, and we're good. So now that we have the bar set up, we actually have to do some logic to actually, well, first let's drag in the stamina bar here in the player UI HUD manager, because that's a serializable field. Now let's go into the game here, and basically we can change our endurance level to something like 10 if you want more stamina, or 100. Make sure you do this with the prefab. Now let's go to the player locomotion manager, and let's start making things cost stamina. So sprinting is a bit of a weird one because it has a tick down every second in games. There's like a dozen ways you can handle this. First, let's say if player.player network manager .current stamina .value is less than or equal to 0, return. And set sprinting to false, then return, because we don't want to allow sprinting if we are out of stamina, obviously. So, and that's a comment we had much earlier, and now that's done, so that piece of logic is added. Now, let's come right down to the bottom here, and we're going to say if player.player network manager .is sprinting .value, as in if we are sprinting and this bool is true, then we want to do some stuff here. Specifically, we want to dock ourselves some stamina. So we can say player.player network manager .current stamina .value minus equals, we're going to make a variable called sprinting stamina cost times time .delta time. So let's go make that variable because right now it doesn't exist. Movement settings, serializable field. I'm going to make this an int for sprinting stamina cost. I'm going to initialize it at say 2. You can make this a float if you want. And you can even make your current stamina and max stamina floats. So that way you can have a bit more, you can use not whole numbers basically. So you can make it a very tiny amount. Now, if we go to the function here, it's going to complain because this obviously is an integer. So like I said, you can round it or you can change it to a float here. It's entirely up to you. Both are valid. It just really depends on what you want. So I'm just going to change this to a float real quick and then go back over here. And I'm going to have to change these to floats too, because now this needs to pass a float instead of an int. So I'll do that and change that to a float. And I'm going to save that. Oh, the new value is giving me an error. So I'm going to say mathf dot round to int because it needs to set a whole number for the UI bar because we have it set to whole numbers. There we go. Save. Now, if I go into the stamina bar here, I'm just going to make it a little bit bigger and change the settings and the size because right now on the screen it's kind of way too small. And I'm going to not play around with this too much because this is a stylistic preference. I'll probably do this off camera. So I'm going to come back now into the player manager. And on the on-network spawn, I'm going to say player network manager dot current stamina dot value is equal to, and then I'm going to say calculate stamina based on endurance level. So this just sets my current stamina up after I've calculated my max stamina. And I'm just going to make sure I say player stats manager dot calculate stamina based on endurance level. And now we have our stamina set up as well. I'm going to put that right below the max stamina actually, so it calculates that and the max and then the current, and then updates our UI bar so it's nice and neat. I'm going to save that. I'm going to go into the game now and see what's happening. So you can see if I run around now, it does deduct the stamina. And it's definitely going down, so that's working as intended. Now, if you wanted to use something that's not so, I guess, like it's chopping off in little sections, you can use a smaller number and apply it at a quicker rate. So you can just basically make it so it's going down every 1/10 of a second, but use a tinier number, and then we'll look like the bar is kind of just melting instead of chunking away. That's, again, all just preference, though. It all does the same thing functionally. So I'll make a function here called regenerate stamina on the character manager. I'm going to say if we're not the owner, return. We only need to run this logic if we are the owner because only owners can edit their network variable, and this is going to edit the current stamina variable, which is a network variable. So if you try to edit this and you're not the owner of the player object, you're going to get an error and Unity's going to complain. So I'm going to say if character network manager dot is sprinting dot value, then return, because we don't want to regenerate our stamina while we're already sprinting. That would be a big no-no. So I'm going to say we do not want to regenerate stamina if we are sprinting or using it. And then right below that, we can start writing some regeneration logic. So I'm going to say if the character network manager, oops, sorry, not that. If we're going to say is performing action, we also want to return because we don't want to regenerate stamina if we're using an action like attacking or something like that. You can make this hyper specific and only use this for some actions, like not regenerating during attacks, but regenerating during like emotes. Then I'm going to make a header for stamina regeneration, and as it suggests, this is going to be a selection of our stamina regeneration settings. I'm going to say private float stamina regeneration timer is equal to 0. And what is this? Well, this is the timer that you get after an action, and if this is above 0, below a threshold, let's say 2 seconds, for example, your stamina won't regenerate. So let's declare that threshold, serialized field float. I'm going to call this regeneration delay. And I'm going to set it to 2. So that's basically the time after an action. I'm going to rename that stamina regeneration delay so it's more clear. So this is the time after you perform an action. You have to wait before your stamina starts going back up. So I'm going to say if our stamina regeneration timer is greater or equal than the delay needed to start regeneration, then now we can regenerate our stamina. So I'm going to say if character network manager dot current stamina dot value is less than character network manager dot max stamina dot value, well then we can add some new stamina to our character. And how much do we want to add per tick? Well, that's entirely up to you. This is also preference. This is going to greatly change the speed and pacing of your game. So I'm going to make first a private float stamina tick timer, and basically this is going to allow the stamina to go back up every time this timer passes a threshold. So I'm going to say stamina tick timer equals stamina tick timer plus time dot delta time, and I want mine to go up, like you can say plus equals also if you want shorthand. I want mine to go up very quickly, like every 10th of a second maybe, or every second. So I'm going to say if stamina tick timer is greater or equal than 0.1, so that would be a 10th of a second, I'm going to say stamina tick timer equals 0, and then I'm going to add stamina to my character. So character network manager dot current stamina dot value plus equals, and now I'm going to say mathf dot round to int, and then I'm going to pass a number. So I can say, we don't have a variable for this yet, so let's make one. I'm going to call it stamina regeneration amount. And actually, I don't need the math f rounds in. I'm just going to make it an integer. I'm not sure why I typed that. So up here, I will say serializable field int, and I'll call it stamina regen amount. And again, this is entirely preference. If you want it to be a larger number, the pacing of your game is going to go a lot faster because you're not going to have much downtime between your attacks. Or rather, you'll have a lot faster regeneration. So I'm going to make mine, we'll try 2 first, and we might edit that. Now, I'm going to actually switch this to the character stats manager. I think it just belongs there. It suits it more because the stamina is definitely a stat. You can keep it on the character manager if you prefer, but I'm going to put both the function and the new variables over here on the character stats manager base class. I'm going to erase it from the character manager. This is, again, just preference. It just makes more sense to me to have this over here. So now that's done, I'm going to make a character manager variable up here, call it character, and I'm going to make a virtual awake method, virtual so we can override it on the player stats manager if we so choose in the future, and believe me, we most likely will. And then I'm just going to say if character.isOwner, basically wherever you have an error now from copying and pasting this, if you did it like me, just put character, and this just gets the information here from the character, and we're fine. So character.character network manager .current stamina .yada yada yada. Stamina is definitely a stat, so it again just makes a lot more sense for me to have it here. And I'm going to paste stamina regeneration amount down here, and now this should be working. Might have to tweak a couple of things when we test it, but let's jump into the game in a second and see. Okay, so I'm going to save this and just checking over everything here on the player manager. Now the player manager, let's just come in here and update and say player stats manager .regenerate stamina. So this is going to be on update. I'm going to make a comment here, say regen stamina, and let's save that. Okay, so now we go into the game here, and I'm going to consume stamina by sprinting, and that works fine. And now I'm going to stop, and yes, that goes back up. But it goes back up kind of quick. There's no delay, so I'm just going to go down here, and this is because we're not actually setting our stamina regeneration timer at all to 0 if we do an action. So let's make a public virtual void, and I'm going to call this reset stamina regeneration or regen timer. And basically I'm going to put in an int for the old value and then an int for the new value. And this is going to make sense momentarily, but let's start off very simple. I'm going to say stamina regeneration timer is equal to 0. And let's go back over to our player manager and let's make sure we call this function every time our stamina changes. So let's go back to the player manager just like before. Let's go to on network spawn, and we only want to do this if we are the owner, because only the owner should be editing the UI of the stamina bar because it's the local player's UI. So let's say player network manager.current stamina.onValue changed plus equals player stats manager.reset stamina regeneration timer. And that's going to give us an error because I forgot we changed that to a float. So let's make sure we change the int to a float. So old value and new value, int should be float and float. And I didn't change this. This is wrong too. The stamina regeneration delay should be 0. It should not be stamina regeneration delay. So I'm going to quickly change that. And you can see there's no more error. So I'm going to save that. I'm going to come back over here, change that to 0. So stamina regeneration timer equals 0. Now, why do we need the old value and the new value? Well, right now, whenever our stamina changes, we got to wait 2 seconds for it to regenerate. We don't want that to happen when you gain stamina. So basically, every time the stamina regenerates, you have to wait 2 seconds. We only want to do that when you use stamina. So we say if the new value, as in our new stamina, is less than our old stamina, then we know we've just done something that's consumed stamina. Then we want to wait 2 seconds before we regenerate. Otherwise, we just want to keep letting it regenerate. Because if you didn't put this here, every time you gained a point of stamina, you have to wait 2 seconds. Because this function is called whenever your current stamina is changing, because we use onValueChanged. So we compare the new value, as in the new stamina value, to the old stamina value. Just to make that clear, I'll rename this to previous stamina amount and current stamina amount. So basically, TLDR, if we're using an action that consumes stamina, we wait 2 seconds. If we're gaining stamina, we don't wait. That's it. Just that simple. Now if I go in the game and I run around a little bit, I'm just going to run until the bar subtracts a little bit so I can see it. And then after that, I'm going to stop, and it should make me wait 2 seconds before my stamina starts regenerating. So let's see. Yes. Okay, so that is working as intended. Now, while we're here, let's go and add a stamina cost to our rolling and our backstepping. And whenever we add more of these actions in the future, like attacks, we'll add stamina costs for those as well. So serializable field, under dodge, I'm going to make a float for the dodge stamina cost. And again, this is on the player locomotion manager. I'm going to make mine 25. This is just a random number. This will depend entirely on how you want your game to feel. So tweak these numbers as you see fit. And then right at the bottom, I'm going to say player.player.network.manager.current.stamina.value minus equals this variable I've just created, so the dodge cost. We also want to make a check to see if we have stamina, and if we don't, we're going to return. So if you don't have stamina, you should not be able to roll. We do that by saying if player.player.network.manager.current.stamina.value is less than or equal to 0, return. Fun fact, you can actually go into negative stamina values in Elden Ring and Dark Souls. All right, save. And let's minimize that and go into the game. So I'm going to sprint. Yeah, my stamina goes down. I'm going to roll. It should go down a big chunk. Yes, it does. I'm going to backstep, and yes, it goes down as well. So there you go, guys. We have a fully functioning stamina system, and we can add a whole lot more to this in the future. The system itself is pretty much complete, but we're going to make more actions in the future that will rely on this system. All right, I know I sound like a broken record, but guess what? If you made it this far, you liked the video, please be sure to drop a like and leave a comment. It genuinely helps out my series so much, and I appreciate all of you that take the time to do that. Also, a shout out to my Patrons. It is because of you guys I get to keep doing this, and I love doing this. I will see you guys in the next episode next week.